Have you read? Have you done your homework and read what we're supposed to have read?
Yes,
Oh, you're a good
yes.
boy.
We were just saying earlier that it's so dense. I loved it. I read it a few times over, but I still feel like I was in like a panic, like feeling like I'm not prepared, but I think it'll be fun.
I shall sit here and learn this evening, I think. Very dense, very, very difficult text, but I did give it a try.
Yeah, yeah.
Hello, Mariana. How are you? Hello,
She might have
TJ. How are
stepped away
you?
for a second.
Oh, did
I
she?
know she was gonna try and hook up and play that short video she had made to
Ah,
start it
okay.
off.
Okay,
So
I
she might
gotcha.
be trying to connect that.
Who else is here? Let's have a look. Okay.
I don't know if you know Susanna, Rob, but
No, don't
she's
think
been
so.
in on these value readings the past few times, and
Oh,
so
Hello, Rob.
hello there, Susanna.
How you
So
doing?
great company.
is that right? Is this the value reading group?
No,
Yeah.
this is not right.
Wait,
Or is it? Wait.
no,
Yes, no, yes, no.
no, it isn't. Actually,
No,
no,
it isn't. Yes,
I'm
it
wrong.
is.
No,
Okay.
no, but it has a lot of value group people coming in this
Okay.
time.
I don't remember
Hi,
if it
Rob.
was
Rob, we
officially
never
that.
met, but I was attending the OMLS talk, and it was great to have you lead that.
Oh,
So
hello there.
nice
You were there, were you? Hello there. You're Michael. Hello, nice to
yeah,
meet you.
I was just I was a silent person on that talk.
Oh, okay. Do you do lots of silence?
So it depends on the group and my mood.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. I'm going to do silence this evening, I think. Susanna, where are you?
I'm in Montreal
Oh, are you? Okay.
as well. I'm from
all
Spain.
over
I
the
may be
place.
going back to Spain soon.
Oh, okay. And where are you from in Spain?
Madrid.
Oh, okay.
And
It's
Listrad,
nice
where are
to.
you from? Where are you?
Well, I'm in the south of England. I'm near the coast on the south of England.
Oh, nice.
I just like doing these groups, you see, because there's people from all over the place. So I'm very inquisitive and I ask people where they are.
Yeah, me too. So
Oh,
whereabouts
Dan.
in the south of
I too
England?
am in Montreal.
Whereabouts? Just
I'm near Bournemouth.
oh, nice.
Yeah.
I've traveled
Okay.
a little bit around the
Cool.
island. So yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Nice making your acquaintance.
I've never been to Madrid yet. I know Barcelona. I know bits of Spain. I know Santander. I went there. I studied there for a while, but I've never been to Madrid, and I'd like to go one day.
I'll welcome you if I'm there.
Hi, Dan.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing well. You?
Good, good. Yeah, can't complain.
Good. So if I understand, Mariana's trying to set up so we could all watch the video together as a nice kickoff. That'd be cool. That'd be super cool.
And welcome to everyone else, Cameron and Francisco, Rodrigo. And yeah, we're getting a good good group joining.
Hey guys, can you hear me? My data plan, it's yeah, sorry. Anyway. Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, sorry. Yeah, my data plan ended, I guess. So let's begin, right? I mean, is Dennis here?
I
Rodrigo?
don't think yet, or I don't know if he is, but I think he was planning on coming. But we weren't sure if it was going to work if you wanted to play that video, or if that's going to be too hard to set up. And we just start.
Oh yeah, yeah. Let's start. Let's go directly
Yeah.
into
Great.
into the text. That's okay. Cool. So I guess first impressions, if any of you are like willing to share. The title is quite deceiving, no?
Yeah, I thought so. I kind of, before I started reading it, I did a little like, I didn't want to like read people's analysis of it before reading, but I did a little searching to kind of get an idea of what to expect. But even then, it was a lot more than I expected. I don't know what anyone else first impression, or was this the first time for people reading it, or had people read it before?
I read it a long time ago and then reread it again. And not that I want to jump to the end, but I found in terms of other people's analysis and other things I've read about it, the biggest divergence comes at the end in people's interpretations of the divine violence. So I don't want to jump there because that's at the end, but I see two very, very, very different interpretations of that. And I'm always wavering which one I like better or which one I could cherry pick the original text in order to support. But I think we should probably work up to divine violence, and then maybe I'll elucidate those two different theories when we get there.
Yeah. I found it interesting. After the first time I read it, I did a little like looking around at what was going on at the time, like who other writers he would have been influenced were writing at the time. And I found that really interesting. I don't remember their names, but I had come across that in like recent really influential essays or books that had just recently come out, and that this could have been somewhat of a response to, or and I thought that context was really.
That's
Did
interesting.
anyone have the chance to read the text in original German? Because I think some of the difficulty of this text comes from the translation of the vocabulary that he uses. Some of the critique that I was reading went really, really hard on translation. That was a little bit missed when you read in English, no?
Sure. Yeah. I
But
wondered that too, how much of it was the translation being difficult.
Can I ask, what are the influences on this man? Is he, am I out of my depth here? Is he from the Frankfurt School? Is that where you see him as coming from?
I think he's like the outsider of the Frankfurt School, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. The others never really loved all of his work. Some of them had some problems with it, and that all comes to a very unfortunate conclusion in the real world, the way that he did not make it out with the rest of them.
Okay.
But yeah, he's kind of, I think from what I understand, he's kind of a bit of an outsider who's on the inside, or other way around.
And do you know, is it this is theoretical clashes, or is it personality clashes? Any ideas?
I couldn't say for sure. I think one of the things I hear is that they found some of his stuff a little too mystical. He was not as rooted in a purely material analysis as the rest of them. Was a little more interested in kind of branching out from that, and that kind of went against the grain of if the Frankfurt School had a coherent program. It just didn't fit so nicely. So I'm not, as for personality, I don't know the social dynamics of the group so well.
Okay, and the mysticism start of it, how does he relate to Judaism?
Oh, this is a good question that I don't know. Because I mean, as far as I know, like a good number of them were Jewish, but I think a lot of them were just, you know, very, very plainly atheist, and it didn't really affect too much their thinking. And perhaps with Benjamin, he just couldn't, you know, just cast it aside and as easily as the rest of them. But I don't know
Right.
if I can't say for sure if he was particularly either had a religious upbringing or maintained some religious or even just spiritual ways of thinking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, this text, we should keep in mind, he wrote this as a pretty young man. I think he was like 29 or 30 when he wrote this. And it's kind of, you know, this is before his kind of turn towards Marxism and historical materialism. Some people trace that to a little bit later, like the 1930s, I think. But yeah, so this is written in 1921. Exactly 100 years ago, and it's still sort of considered his earlier period work. Like he was heavily under the influence of some German anarchists of the time. There's a guy named Gustav Landauer, and some other kind of writers who aren't really remembered today. I was reading an essay by Michael Lowy about Benjamin. I don't know if any of you've heard of him. He's sort of a scholar of Benjamin in the Frankfurt School. But yeah, I just wanted to specify that this was written at Benjamin as a young man, not mature Benjamin.
Was he quite close in theory to Landauer then?
At this point, yes, yeah, absolutely, I would say, yeah.
And the you know, Rosa Luxemburg maybe, and people like that. Would that be about the same sort of time?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about his connections with Luxemburg. That's a good question. She didn't come up in some of the historiography I was reading about Benjamin's intellectual trajectory so much. But it's a good question.
They knew each other, right?
They did they?
I mean, I don't have this very clear in my mind, but in my understanding, they hung out and everything.
I mean, it's interesting that I wrote this in 21. I guess I didn't do my research and figure that out. So I would have assumed it was written more in the 30s, where a lot of the bulk of his other work was, and therefore his critique of violence was coming out of a perception of rising Nazism. But now that I know it's 21, it's probably more a reflection of the end of World War I.
Yeah.
So that's a little perspective.
That's what I read, was that it was very much influenced with the end of World War I, and not, I mean, I'm sure some of the nationalism and obviously World War I and II are kind of flow into each other, but that it was much more because, yeah, being in 21.
There's a companion piece kind of, Capitalism as Religion. He wrote them at the same time, and they sort of mirror each other in weird ways. But even though it's called Capitalism as Religion, like, this is not a Marxist text, which is, yeah, that's later.
No, yeah, he hadn't made his turn towards really reading Marx or sort of, yeah, it's considered his pre-Marxist era.
It's a difficult text. I think Agamben uses it a lot.
How so?
I can see that.
Like in this destitution stuff is a little bit based on this one, and he refers to it explicitly also. But I mean, I'm not capable of like mapping that out very clearly now. I'll try in 5 minutes.
Hey, sorry, my connection. I'm in a public space now, so hi. So sorry. Where were you guys? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. We were kind of talking about the context and how he wrote it when he was much younger, that it was in 21, so not like things in the 30s. And Dan was giving some perspective on like other influences and yeah.
Right. What was the question originally? If he belonged to the Frankfurt School, or
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, like that's the thing about Benjamin. I think it's just his unorthodox reading of history and philosophy, and his inability to maintain his attention to one single subject, as you perceive in the essay. I mean, he jumped from like a quite anarchist perspective of the state and law in the initial period of the. I believe the essay has 4 fundamental theses, and one of them was basically in the first page when he basically his critique of violence. When you read the title, you might assume that it's a liberal perspective, right? Like anti-gun, just let's all get along, and you know, it was just interesting. But he goes directly into that critique of law, critique of state, and from his point of view, it's clear that we cannot have a proper analysis of what it is to fight back if you're not then being fully aware of the fact that there's an oppressor and that violent act of what others might perceive as defense. It's not it's more than just that as simplistic as such as means and methods. And so initially he starts that like, for if violence is a means, a criterion for criticizing, it might seem immediately available. It imposes itself in the question whether violence in a given case is a means to a just or an unjust end. And it's clear that he does not believe that the system has just ends. He says clearly, a critique of it would then be implied in a system of just ends. This, however, is not so.
Yeah, I think that's one of the first points where the text kind of pulls the rug out from under your feet, because I think it's, you know, I think you might think it's going to begin with, okay, so what are just ends? And therefore, like, if we know the just ends, then we can understand justifiable means to reach those ends. And we think maybe, okay, a critique of violence is all about like, what is the ultimate good? What is the ultimate ends? And then when he says, no, we cannot, there's no such thing as just understanding just ends on their own. The real question is, can we, it's not, are there justifiable means towards just ends, but can we judge means in themselves as just or not? And for me, that was, you know, a question that kind of came out of left field, and you know, was kind of opening up to like, okay, so I really don't know where he's going to go with the rest of this text, because we're so conditioned to connecting means and ends in this kind of like linear justification kind of system. So once we remove the question of just ends being irrelevant, and can we question just means, regardless of justifiability. So it's like just versus justifiability. That's what's opening up for, you know, a very, very different way to look at this. And yeah, so right from the get-go, I think it's quite interesting and challenging.
It's quite, exactly. I think it's rare for a thesis to be provided so quickly and so densely, and just like to make you question the whole concept of the justice system as itself, right? And what's justice even? What's legality? Sorry, I interrupted someone.
Well, and I think similar to like you said, even the title can be, well, not misleading, but you can assume the wrong thing, because even like, what is a critique? You know, where he's not critiquing violence as if saying like a critique of it as an action or as a means or as a tool, but like, what does it mean? What does it serve? What value does it? And I also, one of the big things I really enjoyed is that early on, even when he's talking about the means and the ends and the natural law versus the professional law, I feel like he's dropping like little hints that like, okay, this might seem like a dichotomy and like these are the two opposing views, but even early on you get a sense that he's going to go into something more, like, and say that there's something more, and that these two are opposing. They're both working together to withhold, you know, something else, and that we need to escape this sphere, as he calls it. I don't know. if anyone else wants.
Yeah, like a simplistic understanding of critique would be like, okay, so after we critique it, we're going to decide, is it A, good, or is it B, bad? And it's this kind of dichotomy that we always need to look for. Okay, we're going to look for these universal truths, good, bad, right, wrong, just, unjust, and really it's like, no, we have to kind of break out of this very, very dichotomizing way of thinking, and a critique is not about coming up with these ultimate declarations, but it's about, and I guess he's presupposing what later most critical theory is, okay, what ways of thinking, what purposes do they serve, what interests group do they benefit? And yeah, so the critique is not about, you know, coming up with, okay, let's make a list of here, this forms of violence are good and this form is bad and these ends are just, not, but looking at how these concepts will be used and abused and manipulated and defined and categorized over time in order to legitimate various authorities and then to mystify the sources of their authority, right? I mean, there was a bit about like, oh, I wish I could remember the line from the text, but it was all about the violence that also points to its own historical genesis, right? And a lot of the violence that is the support of the power of authority comes from the mystification and the burial of its genesis in a simple act of violence, as if it was always there. And, you know, and perhaps that's what he means by mythical, you know, something that's, you know, not exactly historical, but, you know, kind of like super historical. But really the point is, no, everything has an historical origin in social dynamics, and we need to always be willing to dig back and dissect that.
I mean, if you look at the title, it's also ambiguous on some other levels, right? There's the Kritik der Gewalt in German. Gewalt is also branch of government, like in Montesquieu, the Gewaltenteilung, like the executive branch, the legislative branch. This stuff is also called Gewalt, and the der can also double. The der can be a genitive der or possessive. I don't even know what the grammatical terms are, but it can be a critique of violence, like you criticize violence, or it can be the critique that is inherent in violence. So like how violence can be critical. You can read it in all those ways. So it's I don't know if that was intended, but there's a lot of ambiguity in the title itself. I did find the Agamben quote, by the way, that made this connection, and I think through him, a text like this flows into the politics of like groups like Tikkun very, very, very strongly, and I can read it if you're interested. Maybe it takes like 1 or 2 minutes, but I'll read it. If the fundamental ontological question today is not work, but inoperativity, this goes back to his whole Heidegger shit, right? And if this inoperativity can, however, be deployed only through a work, then the corresponding political concept can no longer be that of constituent power, but something that could be called destituent power. And if revolutions and insurrections correspond to constituent power, that is, a violence that establishes and constitutes the new law, in order to think a destituent power, we have to imagine completely other strategies whose definition is the task of the common politics. And so that maps onto what he calls divine violence, right? A power that was only just overthrown by violence will rise again in another form in the incessant, inevitable dialectic between constituent power and constituted power. Violence which makes the law and violence that preserves it. It is a destitution of this type that Benjamin imagined in the essay Critique of Violence, trying to define a form of violence that escaped this dialectic. And then he quotes Benjamin on the breaking of this cycle that plays out in the sphere of the mythical form of law, on the destitution and Setzung, which, by the way, I think is a translation of Luther, of Paul's Katargane, but it's a whole different thread again, of law with all the powers on which it depends. Ultimately, therefore, on the destitution of state violence, a new historical epoch founds itself. So if you read like the coming community by Agamben, or like this coming kind of rhetoric that you also find in Derrida and Tikkun, that I think that sort of is that comes from this essay to some extent. Through Agamben. Agamben is a key figure there.
In what way do you think they have developed the concept or dissected it from their framework?
I don't know. I think they just don't. They want to rethink revolution, right? They don't want. Like revolution cannot be just the taking of power, because then it's inevitable ebb and flow of new powers that will then be, and they want to get out of that. And you could call that an anarchist kind of perspective, perhaps. I don't know. But it's in groups like Tikkun or whatever. It's also perhaps in the background is the disaster of the Soviet Union and stuff like this, right? Like the new power, like the new king will just be like the old king in the end. So what is a coming politics, and how Benjamin describes that is interesting, but also mystifying, right? Because he says literally, you won't recognize it. Like that's like, what's the quote in the end? I don't know if I wrote it down. It may be, but he literally says it may be unrecognizable. So that's kind of interesting what you should do with that. There's a couple of mystifying phrases in that, right? Like he also says at some point, language, the proper sphere of understanding, is inaccessible to violence. And that's, I don't understand that. I think language can be completely violent. I think there's a lot of violence in language, but I just don't understand what he means by that. But
for that, you have to refer to his consequent essay on language as such and on the language of men.
I've read that,
which we can read afterwards. But I mean, it is interesting though, because I found that it is often attributed as his most anarchist essay, and by a few critics. But the fact that he goes into that thesis and knows that it's not sufficient, like he just makes that postulation in the first part, and then he goes on to maintain a more a further critique on how, yes, the state is not sufficient and it will always perpetrate violence through legislation and through its property defense and it develops further, right? Like, don't you think that's interesting that it gets so, as you said, it gets so mystical and it gets
I like that as well, though. Like, I didn't mean to sort of like dismiss it with that. I kind of like this whole mystical vibe. But,
yeah, it can get a little bit too much, but you know, it's fun. No, but so I on Agamben and like I guess I haven't read their analysis, so I was wondering, I mean, if you would like to explain that in a little bit. Should we go chronologically, or should we go through like jumping around as he does into what concepts attracted you from the reading?
Well, I think whatever topic anyone has that they found interesting, bring it up. I don't think we don't need to go chronologically if no one else does. Right.
Also, just real quick, please, especially people who haven't been in this group before, feel free to jump in, or I think there's like a little hand up button or something, but yeah, don't be shy if you want to. Anyway.
Well, I mean, if no one has anything, I'd like to bring up one part that I thought was interesting. Sorry, I'm not using my video now because my internet's a little wonky, and it'll help out. But there was a point where he's talking about understanding and its potential that understanding was one way that people can come to an agreement without use of violence. Although I think in other parts he kind of contradicts that. But he says that this is really, as far as I understand it, that this is really only possible between individual parties, individual peoples, and in contrast to that, an understanding without violence is kind of impossible when you talk about issues between nation states or between classes. And I was thinking, and that the reason that distinction is because when we have two different people, if we kind of are blind to their material different circumstances, it's kind of seen as two equals. Whereas you can never think in terms of classes as equals. You can never think in terms of a nation versus its population, or between two nations as equals, because there will be, you know, very, very stark antagonisms and very, very stark power differentials between them. So that, you know, so whenever like so like in a liberal society, when say, okay, let's get the owners together and let's get the labor together, and, you know, we can all just work it out, that it's that itself is really just an impossibility because of the imbalance of power that is already established when these two parties get together. Now, of course, with individual people, it's not exactly, I mean, say two people come together and they're equals. I mean, that's also kind of flattening of the concept. But Did anyone else get that when he talks about understanding as a way to, you know, come to an agreement, have a contract without violence, which contradicts other places where he does say like all contracts have kind of this implicit understanding that at the end of a contract there's violence. Like, we'll agree to do this, but as long as we both agree that if you don't do your part, I can come and like either beat you up or call the cops and tell them to beat you up or throw you in jail, et cetera, et cetera.
Individual
There's
relations.
diplomats, right?
No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. That was like just when he said, I was reminded of the diplomats as the mediators of these like big things, but that's I don't even remember what he says about that. Sorry, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that. Yeah, I think, to me at least, and I'm not sure that I completely picked up what he was saying on this, but on an individual level, like, you can work outside of the law system. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong with that, but like, you know, you can negotiate and work through differences without needing to resort to violence. But, and like when he said differences between classes and between nation states and things, well, between classes, there's already a violence inherent in it. So of course there's going to be, you know, like that it's unavoidable, because that's a class system in itself has violence already. So any kind of conflict or further interaction is going to have violence. I don't know if I was picking up.
Right. Well, so would that be like in the sense that, you know, between two individuals, there's an implicit idea that violence is possible, but but two individuals can kind of function with this implicit idea of violence and never actually need to resort to it. Whereas the mystification that, you know, classes can get together and work something out without violence. It's not just that there's implicit violence at the end of that, but that there was already violence in the formation of classes to begin with. You know, the dispossession of one, giving the total leveraging bargaining power to the other one.
I guess that's how I see it, but I don't know if that's something he was saying. But yeah, that whole part was something I wish I had more time to revisit and try and, I think, yeah, I don't know. What did anyone else think of that?
I found it interesting when there is a point, because even though it's very complex, there's points in which it appears that you could actually make like slides out of it. So that's why it's tension. But there is one point in which basically in his analysis, it seems basically like a mathematical proof that if you factorize certain elements that are implicit in violence and analyze it that way, you can reach some kind of reductio at X. I don't know if it's absurdum, because I don't think it's the case, but he is basically layering out, factorizing out the different elements. But then at some point he makes a mathematical point that I find in this demonstration. He says that even though in this justification he's looked at all the points, no justice can be can be evaluated without its context. Every single violent act will always be depending on the particular context. I think that also ties with what Mikey was saying. And I found that, and in relation with how you why individuals can deal with it, where the state can come in, applying the rules that are sometimes based on what you would say statistics, like, you know, the averaging of opinion making through the creation of symbolic figures, that because that's actually the contract that you go in, right? But it's interesting to me that when he says that he pieces out this notion of violence, there is a point at which you just cannot make generalizations. It's just not possible. And that to me is very powerful, because I see generalizations in violence always happening, and this completely dispels that. Don't know.
He goes into the class struggle on the, I have it on Reflections. It's page 291. And basically, he establishes that law restricts the use of wholly nonviolent means because they understand that once this is normalized, then class struggle will always make sure. I mean, he also goes back into critiquing the different kinds of strikes and how people have categorized them and later on extrapolated from such distinctions and even provided terms such as looting and just like through the legal system we perceive not the act itself of seeking justice or retribution or a demand, but it is always filtered through the justice system and ethics and the legislations that are provided by the mediator between the ruling class and the judge, which is of course the state, and where it'll always defend the benefits of a particular class, and also I guess to prevent any revolutionary attempt, it's important to maintain the state power and condemn violence, right? What do you guys think of? I guess, would you like to define mythical violence, like your perspective on it? I don't know. What do you think?
Aged, right? Like where he claims that organized labor is apart from the state, basically the only subject that can be violent, that's entitled to violence. Today, no way. Like there is no organized labor. In many countries, unions have been prohibited. And strikes, I mean, like this is, I mean, this has aged. Here the text has aged on this point. That's sad, but yeah.
Yeah, I definitely remarked on that part where he said, yeah, aside from the state, perhaps organized labor is the only other entity that can legitimate their own use of violence, and it stood out, and it clearly, like you said, it's certainly it's showing its age. But I mean, even then at the time, was that really, was that a notion that could have been taken more seriously back then?
Well, this was written 2 years after the Spartacus uprising, wasn't it?
Yep. That's right.
Yeah. Later, I was going to ask what, if there were parts of it people thought if he was living, I mean, obviously with anybody, it's 100 years old, but like what things stuck out that, and that was a big one for me, was when he was talking about organized labor. And I think like it's all but illegal in the US and all over. I still think. Oh,
I'm not sure that you can generalize about it all quite so much. I mean, organized labor is still quite a big factor in France. It's just over the border from here, and I mean, you know, they had a strike in France December a year and a half ago, brought the country to its knees. It was over pension rights. So I think workers can. I think they can in some countries still actually have some sort of leverage. It's nothing like, you know, it was in the heyday of the unions and that, but they're not completely killed off, I don't think. What about the situation in Spain? That's always been a country with a big history of trade unionism. Has that been sort of fairly crushed by the state by now? I don't follow these things too much.
I basically live there, but I don't know, to be honest.
Well, interestingly, the Minister of Work right now, which belongs to Podemos, has a long history in the Asturian mining unions. She's the daughter of very active there. But she's not liberal at all in her history. I don't think it's dead, but the problem is the Franco times gave a lot of power to the enterprise, to the powers that be. I think she's doing a great job at trying to be that diplomat. Anyway, that's just the note.
I mean, post Franco, with regard to the CNT in Spain, the main anarchist union over there, The main argument was how the state was trying to sort of incorporate the unions. They did, for example, there was the Moncloa Pact, wasn't there? And there were things
Yeah.
like they would give money to the unions to have their elections, and they tried to sort of
Yes.
get their foot in the door and control the unions in that way. So independent unions took a bit of a bloody nose out of all that situation. And I
Yes.
imagine that the membership of the CNT today is probably very low compared with how it was in the past.
So it's basically mercantile. There is a point in which by giving support to it, it also mercantilized it in a way and created little ghettos of power. I know because my brother is a nurse and he belonged to an actual union, nurses union, and he told me all about it. And it's nurses are still well. There's some communities that still do well, but there's always between the multitude of them, there's going to be one of them that, you know, it's heavily tainted as usual. But I think it's still somewhat healthy in some traditional jobs. Certainly not for the new ones.
But there's also, I mean, yeah, it's sure, there's still organized labor here and there, but the whole question of organized labor has also lost in importance, right? Because of
yeah, well, but in
between
Spain,
life and
like
work
the
has
public
shifted.
workers is mostly like in public positions. That's where you're going to find the most remainders of that.
True.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And in Spain has a lot of public workers.
But I mean, nevertheless, whatever kind of violence that organized labor can resort to, or whatever kind of power that they can kind of take hold of and employ for their own means, it wouldn't really correspond to the mythic violence of Benjamin's text. I think, if anything, that would probably correspond to what we still have yet to define as the divine violence. Although, I mean, this is not taking into account some of the more poetic language he uses about divine violence, you know, violent without, you know, bloodless and stuff. But I can't really, unless organized labor, you know, engages in activities such as that they're really able to radically transform, you know, society through their activity, through their striking, and which is a kind of a violence against, you know, capital circulation in a sense. And then it can really establish a new order. Maybe that could be mythic violence, but in the meantime, right now, it just seems to be bucking up against a mythical violence, one that's kind of mystified its own historical justification, I think.
Like I don't know if this is a tangent, but there's people like Claire Fontaine who also refer to this particular essay and say that you know, life and work have become blurred, and this makes a normal kind of worker strike useless right now. We need a human strike, because we're always producing value. We need to stop producing value. So there are people thinking about this, but
by human strike, is that like general strike?
Yeah, but no, it's more general than a general strike. I've heard her say, but what it means then exactly, I don't know.
Like not just a strike in production, but like a strike in consumption.
Yeah. I guess. Yeah.
I would propose possibly just quickly going back to the beginning of the essay, because we kind of hopped over the terms he starts off with. He starts off juxtaposing these two approaches to legal theory, which I'm not, it's not my area of expertise. I'm not sure how outdated, you know, but from what I understand, it seems right. So he juxtaposes natural law theory to legal positivism. And I'm trying to wrap my head around what he finds. So both of them have a slightly different relationship to violence, but they both have violence involved in their kind of, they're both a kind of an instrumental means and have an instrumental means and structure of reasoning. And violence fits into that. It fits into natural law theory as a means to natural ends. And then for legal positivism, violence is justified as a means, you know, going back through precedent and things like that, sort of in just a purely internal way. But both of those theories of law involve violence as part of this means end or instrumental reasoning structure. And then later he brings up mythical violence, and that's a little bit different, because that's sort of through a foundational act of violence, it's law making. So yeah, I just want to. Does anyone have any thoughts about those juxtaposed legal theories that he brings up at the beginning?
I don't know that context.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess that like the natural violence, which in simple terms ends justify the means, if that works
Right.
out, you know, is kind of explanation that like most violence will strive to. So, however, outside of these two ways, these two coins, the natural law and positive law, whatever kind of authority, you know, attempts to establish its power through violence and then retroactively turn that into a justified law. Like the idea is like to eventually take on the guise of natural law, regardless of whether it is. But I mean, the way I understand it is that Benjamin at the beginning wants to then dismiss this natural law theory and at least focus more on the positive law, whereas you need to look into your shit. Am I frozen?
No.
Oh, no.
No, you're
Sorry.
good.
Yeah, you know, and like I keep saying, you know, mystifying the origins and everything. So, I mean, is that oversimplifying to say natural law is just a fancy way of saying ends justify the means?
Natural law, I think, refers to like the Darwinistic stage in which things will happen or develop in a certain fashion because the through evolutionary or natural ways we are intended to develop that way. So like it's more deterministic and probably more like making attributes to the material which justifies, for example, someone being like bigger than another, or it's
right. So less ends justify the means, but like more along the lines of, you know, we're always heading we're always evolving, always progressing, always getting better and better. So wherever we've ended up, whatever means that have been employed to get us here have to by default be naturally justifiable because we're always becoming more advanced or civilized or whatever such bullshit.
Yeah, and then we have on the other hand the positive law, and which is a result of the product of history, and again a positivist approach, right? That just through justification and through obtaining justness by undermining the Darwinistic principles. Sorry, someone wants to say something?
Yeah, I claim my rights as a historian of political philosophy. And I'm mad at Benjamin for the way he treats Spinoza, that is my author. This is 17th century legal theory. Natural law is a ideal concept of what comes before the state. The idea is you need a social contract to get into the state situation, and what's before the social contract is a natural law, and what's after the social contract is a positive law. What Spinoza says is not that before the state you are you have de jure the same right, the right to whatever you have the possibility to do. In fact, Spinoza's point is that you retain the same right in a state situation, but doesn't matter. We are not talking about it in this moment. And positive law, the law after the state is constituted, is the one that is guaranteed by the system of the state. So in a state law situation, the problem with violence is if it's justified by the corpus of law, by the structure of the state, inside the coherence of the legal system. I think Benjamin's point, if I can, yes, is this antinomy would prove insoluble, sorry for my pronunciation, if the common dogmatic assumption were false, if justified means on the one hand and just ends on the other were in irreconcilable conflict. I think Benjamin is just is exactly pointing out this concept. They are in irreconcilable conflict. And
sorry, what page is it? The one quoted.
Page 2 in my edition. Page 278 in. Just the 1, 2, third paragraph.
I mean that's interesting about Spinoza, who I don't know too much about, but always said I'd like to learn more about. So you're saying that the natural law is kind of like a, would you say that natural law is kind of this universal agreed upon principles that are there before the individual engages in a relationship with the state and negotiates like rights and responsibilities as a citizen? Is that kind of what you were saying?
Yes, this is the idea of natural law is the current that sustained natural law is use naturalism, and the main concept was that of a contract, of a pacta sunt servanda, pacts, agreements have to be maintained. It's a philosophy born in Netherlands among merchants. And the concept of agreement is fundamental, and that's why their image of the building of a state is a contract, a pact, an agreement. It's a Hobbes. The idea is conceptually, it doesn't need to be historically an historical truth, but you have a starting position of the natural state of affairs that is in Hobbes' version, war of everybody with everybody, because it's governed by natural law. That means everybody does what Benjamin says about Spinoza is actually Hobbes. Everybody does in the natural state everything he wants or can. And so it's a war of everybody with everybody. So everybody agrees on building on a contract that builds a state which is charged of enforcing violence on everybody when they break the law or assault somebody. the idea is the concentration of violence. Spinoza is totally different because he the whole point with the state is that it's physically impossible to alienate one's natural power, natural rights, because the rights equals to individual power that is his same existence, his life. You cannot alienate your power to do stuff, and or your life or your desires. And so even if you talk of a social contract, a social contract cannot work. It is a continuous negotiation and a physics of powers. It's everything is about how individual powers and desires can converge to a common goal, to cooperation. But this was not about Spinoza. I would like to have a reading group on theological political treatise, but this is not the case tonight. Going back to Benjamin, I think his main point is if you watch violence as an end, his whole point is the two point of views are irreconcilable, are contradictory. They cannot work together. You cannot justify violence as a mean because it's irreconcilable with any end, any just end you can you could imagine. It's just contradictory. I was quiet because I hadn't the time to reread the text, and my last lecture was 25 years ago. But this is what I got from it 25 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that perspective. I think it's really telling that that social contract, you know, had its roots in a bunch of merchants getting together and figuring out ways to, you know, make business smoother.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What you said at the end there, Simona, kind of brings me back to what I was trying to get across before, talking about like how either way you look at it, whether through the natural law or through the positivist lens, theories of law, either way, there's a means end or instrumental structure of practical reasoning that violence is fitting into. And ultimately, like the big picture of this essay is that at the end, by the end, Benjamin's saying that the divine violence that he's juxtaposing with both, you know, the violence of the state and with mythical violence, it doesn't have that means end or instrumental structure of practical reasoning. It's not, and he uses this metaphor of unalloyed. I don't know what the original German word is, but like unalloyed, just sort of, it's a pure, almost spontaneous. Divine violence is a pure, spontaneous form of violence that's juxtaposed with this more instrumental, rational form of violence that both mythical and state violence are caught up in. And at the end, I just wanted to read this. This is at the very end of the essay. It's like the second to last sentence. He says, divine violence may manifest itself in a true war exactly as it does in the crowd's divine judgment on a criminal. But all mythic lawmaking violence, which we may call executive, is pernicious. Pernicious too is the law-preserving administrative violence that serves it. So he's drawing this distinction right at the very end of the essay between and he's lumping both, you know, administrative violence and mythical violence in one basket, and then he's juxtaposing that to divine violence. And kind of the difference that I see between them is just this the spontaneity of divine violence. Like he talks about, he says the crowd's divine judgment on a criminal versus this instrumental rational reasoning structure that all of the other ones are caught up in, enmeshed in. Does that make sense?
I think it's a tricky term. I didn't like. There was one reading that came to mind when I sort of compared it to Hannah Arendt's book on Eichmann, where she claims that he was living in a criminal system, but he needed to have this sovereignty of mind to go against the law, and that would be justice. Like I brought it a little bit so in connection with that or something, that like in Derrida's reading of Benjamin, there's also this justice that is sort of like sovereign to the law, that is bigger than the law. The law doesn't determine what's just. There's a bigger notion of justice with a big J. And I sort of connected it with that, but I'm not sure if that fits with the whole mystical divine language. I think that's tricky.
I read somewhere in one of the critiques that I was reading that like basically he said that Derrida, after this, obviously after Benjamin, went to basically many of the distinctions that resonated, like many of the distinctions that he made between natural law and stuff, like many years later, like philosophy had advanced a little bit, were completely destroyed. For example, saying things like, from the point of the person making the violence, whoever he is, they can never know if they are manifesting divine violence or not. It cannot be said. And that distinction actually later on has been put in question quite a lot. So when we are saying, oh, like it's gonna just appear, this divine violence, you will never know it. And that's a problem.
Yeah, and that's the paradoxical.
It's also like it's terrorism also, right?
Right, and that's what, like that quote at the very end of the essay about the crowd's spontaneous judgment on the criminal. It's kind of, there's something almost ominous about that, because it's spontaneous. It's not mediated by these forms of instrumental rationality, and like Susanna just said, like you can't really know if you're enacting it until you don't know in the moment if you are indeed enacting it. So it is kind of a slippery concept. And I think, I know Derrida made some remarks about, I found it kind of ridiculous, actually. He said something about how Benjamin talks about divine violence doesn't spill blood, and Derrida juxtaposed that to like the gas chambers in Auschwitz, like killing people without spilling blood. It just seemed like a loose, silly.
Yeah, or the example that he was saying about living in a criminal state. Like, what do you do when you observe that? Like, from all that you know, according to the rules of the contract that you've gone into, you should follow the rules of the state because you've gone into that pact, but you see that it doesn't match. How do you know what's the real one? I think in the article, I still have it on my screen. It still goes on saying, like, justice is possible, but not knowable through only an act of divine violence, which in all respects will always stand in complete opposition to mythic violence of law. But it's interesting, this opposition between possible and knowable. I think that was very interesting. It goes to putting the same quotes that you were quoting yourself, Dan, here.
So like I said earlier, I have kind of seeing divine violence in two different interpretations. So the first one, where I kind of really focus on the idea of like this bloodlessness and the idea that it kind of forecloses upon violence before violence can even happen. I think there's some talk about like almost like the commandments, or I guess the German term is was it Verneinung or Verwerfung, or like Verwerfung versus Verneinung, like one's a denial and one's a foreclosure, like even happens before that. So like a really crazy example would be according to this idea. Like, say you have a society that's very violent, but everybody is really violent just by like punching each other, just, you know, they just use their hands. So the kind of divine violence would be like if this, you know, authority would just go around very cleanly, surgically, just cutting everybody's hands off. And like every time a new baby was born, just get rid of their hands. And this way it would just foreclose upon the idea of violence. It sounds crazy, but then, and then on the completely other spectrum, I understand divine violence as this violence that has like no real goal. It's simply just a, it's just an expression of frustration, helplessness, voicelessness, and, you know, the kind of idea of like running amok. So I don't know, just getting in your car and barreling down a sidewalk or going on a stabby spree or something like that. And that's like how Zizek
Did we lose Mike?
I think we lost him.
Oh no.
Yeah, I wouldn't define Zizek as divinely violent at all, but he certainly thinks he is.
Who would you? Do you know anyone that manifested divine violence today?
Let's not get there. I think we might have to. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Dan.
Sorry.
Oh,
my Zoom picked me up.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't remember. I don't know exactly at what point my Zoom kicked me out. But yeah.
Zizek was the last word I heard.
Right. Yeah. So for Zizek, the divine violence was like running amok, basically going postal. All these kinds of expressions. You know, there's no real goal to it. It's it's an utterance. It's an expression. It's just a pure like, I am experiencing violence, and I want to, you know, and I want to do violence because I've just had enough.
And I was just going to say before, like a concrete example of like when I was reading this, I was directly connecting it, like, you know, if we're thinking about real world examples, like the uprising in the US last summer, the George Floyd uprising, just like the spontaneous torching of the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis, and just like the sort of just the torching of cop cars in cities all over the country. Just like there wasn't really a means end structure involved in that kind of, you could call it violence if you want. I mean, property destruction, whatever. It was there was a spontaneity where it wasn't a means to something else, even though like the corporate and liberal establishment tries to code it in certain ways after and domesticate it, but it was kind of just this wild, spontaneous. That was the most immediate empirical event that I could kind of relate to Benjamin's concept. Does that, I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, it started off spontaneously as an expression of rage, but I mean, I guess as it grew or more people got involved, there was, even if they didn't have like laid out a clear political program, there was a motivation that we're doing this in order to like gain some recognition and hopefully gain some change. So, and if they were successful and real material policy was enacted in order to, you know, meet their demands, would that then transfer over to mythical violence that, you know, creates new laws, creates new ways of being, is there a divine to mythic violence pipeline?
No, yeah, I think that's the right question to ask. I think it is that tension between like the spontaneity and the unalloyed or pure, divine violence, and then the, you know, state building or state maintaining forms of, so it's been like congealing into something that is congealing into a state-like structure.
Yeah, I remember the 15th of March a few years ago in Madrid, when people, like there was a bunch of people that spontaneously occupied the big main square of the city of Madrid for around a couple of weeks. I don't know if you heard about this. Well, 15th of March is what basically gave the birth to Podemos in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember precisely that because, well, they started like camping, right? Like that was the first thing. Obviously, some of the people that started it had probably very clear ideas, but then a lot of people joined in. And what they organized, I think from the second week onwards, during the night, it was a bit messy though, but you could join. They had set in different smaller squares around the big one, places where they would discuss specific topics. Like, and people were invited to, anyone could go, and like they had this system of debate and stuff. But to me, it was very interesting how it jumped from like discontent and we want to occupy to directly make rules. Like people, like when you went to the meetings, people were already like, it's nice, it's beautiful to see organizing, but at the same time, at that very point that they are organizing, they will already start putting in all these structures of a state already. And it's not been 2 weeks. You know, and it was interesting, like when you ask how that happens, I don't know how that happens. I don't think that even that kind of expression is that chaotic. There are elements and there are voices that are heard more than others, even when they are trying not to. There's all sorts. I don't know where it goes wrong, but definitely in the transformation from divine to mythical, something happens there.
And like all famous revolutions of the past couple hundred years, like we can kind of think about it in those terms, like, you know, starting with the French Revolution, the Paris Commune, the Russian Revolution, all have these kind of those dynamics, more or less, you know, some congeal more or less into state structures, but there's always that tension in any sort of in thinking about revolution.
Yeah, I think we should be able to bring more technically Deleuze and Guattari and like, you know, Plateau's into the design of these things, like how they crystallize, like the notion of the crystallization of structures into plateaus and the dissolve and how they dissolve as well. Like it would be interesting to see in this context anyway.
I think that, and we totally should, by the way. And I think a distinction between mythical and divine, and I would frankly think that we could dedicate another session to going through these themes. But he says that that mythical violence is bloody power over mere life for its own sake, divine violence, pure power over all life for the sake of the living. The first one demands sacrifice, the second accepts it. And later on, he says that it strikes without bloodshed and finally by the absence of all lawmaking. And I think that's the main distinction, that it does not intend to impose the status or the system that it's intended to dismantle, but it hopes that it'll cease, and that's when you acknowledge. Later on in the arcades, and I don't mean to like reference another of his books, but it's very important to see to understand his perception of time and the way in which history is perceived by Benjamin, and that just through disruption. And I think he even addressed this in a few other essays, that there's something even in the disruptor that if truly justified, and it's not intended to only create chaos, but there might be some truth to the disruption that society acknowledges and remembers the character. And later on, I mean, then you have to fight the myth. And I think that that aspect, that I think the middle of the essay, mythical violence, I think he was still working out these concepts, and I think that's for me the hardest and most dense concept building in his postulations. But do you guys feel like you would want to juxtapose the essay to another, or do you feel like we have covered it enough?
Well, yeah. But before we ask that, just about that quote that you just mentioned, I mean that really stuck with me and kind of tripped me up on. I thought I was getting this mythic versus divine violence, you know, dichotomy, and then the line, you know, mythic violence demands sacrifice and divine violence accepts it. I mean that really didn't make sense to me. I mean, divine violence accepting the sacrifice that mythic violence proposes. I have no idea what to think about this. I was hoping some of you might have some interesting Thoughts
I
on
think
that
it's
one?
subjugation, the main difference, that who is able to enact the divine violent act is coming from a framework of being the one who is facing oppression, and so a continuation of this oppressed state, or the cessation of it, the ceasing of it for the sake of change, would be the sacrifice that just accepts. I think that's my reading of it.
Wait, so accepting the sacrifice is just giving in to the violent authority of mythic power structures, and in the hopes that
Of confronting it with
Mhm.
your life or whatever.
I'm not sure this makes any sense, but one figure that comes to mind is Mohamed Bouazizi, the guy who torched himself in Algiers and basically started the Arab Spring because someone got like angry at him selling fruit or whatever, and he just set himself on fire. That's accepting a sacrifice of like injustice leading to some sort of uprising, or but I don't know if this makes any sense. It's just a figure that came to mind.
I think that makes sense.
I mean, I definitely thought of that figure. I didn't know the name, but yeah, the fishmonger who set himself on fire, that led to the to everything that happened there. But yeah, the way you just put it now is like setting himself on fire is accepting the sacrifice. Is that like I'm sacrificing myself as a way to accept the fact that your mythic violence makes my life and the life of everybody I know who's in my situation unlivable, and therefore by ending my life, I am violently exposing the unlivability that your mythical violent law has created.
I mean, like doing suicide like that, basically, what's the message that that's sending, right? Or I mean, I don't think that person, it's either I cannot take this anymore, so I end my life here, or could be also saying like, if you take it more in a higher level, saying like, well, by belonging to a state, one thing that the state does is protect my life. So by me taking my own life, I'm also like in a way attacking directly your ability to protect me.
Yeah, that's great.
I think Benjamin opposed throughout the essay and other of his works. I mean, he opposed the perspective of judging again the individual case, which we are perceiving as divinely violent or divine violence, because he's like, don't focus on the semantics or the complexity of the ethical problem regarding that who is enacting the violent act, the divine violent act, but again, like what led them, where are the perpetrators of this horrible incident that they are resisting? I think he really was like that's how he started so strongly from the first thesis, that just like we're again going back into this enlightenment-based perception of ethics by doing that. So, you know, he thought that divine violence was inevitable, and that it was the only moment in which we would experience through history, through the ending of the repetition, the modus in which we have experienced through subjugation and oppression society to a degree, some living better than others, but that's my reading of it anyway.
Let's not forget that Gewalt in German is the enforcement of law, and Benjamin is what Benjamin is discussing is mainly the violence as enforcement of law. And do you know George Agamben, Homo Sacer? It strikes me how this book is all in one of the latest, the critique of mythical violence as a foundation of law and of the violent regime and enforcing regime of states is all in the last pages of this essay. The one about sacred. What does it mean that life is sacred? Establishing the sacredness of life is to establish its ability to be killed, is to reduce men to their being subject to power in as much they can be declared sacred and they can be killed. I think when Benjamin talks about divine violence, it's quite what Graeber calls play in the Utopia of Rules. It's something hazardous, something that is out of the frame of the frame of law. It's outside the rules of law, the rule of law, and in this way, it's destroying the system of the legal system. This is my. Does it make sense?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely points in the paper that we read where where Benjamin talks about how one of the things the state has the biggest problem with when it comes to violence is not violence in itself, but that the violence of the individual citizen or person exposes the arbitrariness of the violence of the system, and therefore that's one of the main reasons they need to control and regulate and who can use violence and when and how, not because it's damaging or hurtful, but because it's threatening to the legal system.
I was going to say what Simona was just drawing attention to, I think was really interesting at the end of, towards the end of the essay, when he has this critique of what he calls the doctrine of the sanctity of life. Just to bring it back to, I think that definitely has a connection with Agamben and Tikkun and sort of the whole trajectory of thought, this kind of critique of the liberal political philosophical idea that the sort of the biological individual, like starting off with the biological individual as something sort of primary, as opposed to something, I think from Benjamin or Agamben's perspective, something that's kind of subtracted from a more holistic, what they would call form of life. So like in Benjamin, he says on page 251, he says, the proposition that existence stands higher than a just existence is false and ignominious. If existence is to mean nothing other than mere life, and it has this meaning in the argument referred to, it contains a mighty truth, however, if existence, or better, life, means the irreducible total condition that is man. So he's kind of juxtaposing, like, yeah, the kind of he kind of, I think he almost calls it like a new fetish somewhere, like just sort of the deifying of what Agamben I think would call bare life, and juxtaposing it to Benjamin's more holistic view of being in the world, and saying that so existence isn't something more fundamental or important than just existence. Just existence is more fundamental and important. Existence is something that is filtered or subtracted out from that. And yeah, so I see that sort of line of thought right at the end, kind of, I think there's a whole trajectory of thought that comes out of that.
Again, I think we should go back to those pages and dedicate more time to that if possible, if you guys agree. It's quite difficult. I'm gonna get in trouble for having my mask off, but it's so hot. Divine violence. Just kidding. Yeah, so I mean, we've been talking about it for an hour and 30 minutes. How do you feel? Do you want to propose another text? How do you guys feel? Do you want to continue? Do you want to?
If we continue on this text, maybe it'd be great if someone, if there's some other like texts that comment on this that we could add to the discussion. Or Dan, did you maybe suggest some in an email last week? Or is that too?
Oh, I'm not sure.
I'm getting a little confused with the multiple groups going on, but yeah, I mean, I would continue this if we add some later text that comments on this or contrasts with it, even if it doesn't directly reference Benjamin, but we think it might be interesting to bring into comparison or contrast with.
I think there's like well, I mentioned both these texts, but there's the Benjamin text called Capitalism as Religion that is very short, and that's basically a companion piece to this, or I think you can read it that way. And Agamben's Destitution, which is also short, but this. But like these are just suggestions, you know. I don't want to say that we should read that, but like I think the Agamben text is one that translated all these concepts of Benjamin and gave them like a whole trajectory that Dan also just commented on and like brought it up to Tikkun and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But both those might be interesting, but I'm also down with anything else.
Agamben, yeah, I'm interested in that. I never read much of him, so would definitely give that a shot.
Before we move on, I've got a question, but I don't know if you guys are done talking about like future texts. So I haven't read this very carefully, like, you know, like taking careful notes. So if you can please correct me about my interpretation. So there's this part where he talks about, you know, the strike, and he says, you know, a strike, can I really consider that violence? You know, you're emitting actions, you know, it's really a non-action. So can you really call that violence? And then in that paragraph, he makes a sort of arguments like, nah, yeah, it's kind of violence because, you know, I think it was a bizarre argument trying to contrive a way to say it is a form of violence, that we can see it as a form of violence. And it strikes me that, yeah, he wants, I was trying to think of a definition of violence that could contain both things, you know, violence as in like punching someone, and violence as a strike could be considered violence. And I was thinking, okay, what if we say that violence is like disabling some entity, regardless of what level? So like on the material level, of course, violence against a person is, for example, removing their hands or their death. So removing the organism's ability to function. But there's another level, the social level, where you have these like social constructs like the state or a team, you know, that doesn't exist in like the material level, but it exists on a social level. So like a strike would be violence because it disables a state from executing its functions. You know, it's like removing a hand of a state. The state can't do certain things if you have a general strike. And so I was wondering, is that a reasonable interpretation of like, does he say somewhere in the text, oh no, does that make sense? Is what I'm asking, I guess, basically. Within the context of the book.
Are you like wondering like of the validity of like hierarchy, putting like different forms of violence in a hierarchy, like physical violence here, social violence here, language violence there, like that kind of thing?
I'm thinking of like a general definition of violence, because it looks like he's wanting to say that multiple things are violence, like but depending on the level, like regardless of level. So he wants to say there's a certain kind of violence that applies such that we could consider a strike as violence, as well as cutting off someone's hands. So I'm thinking, okay, the way to do that is that, yeah, there's different levels of, like, a strike really sounds absurd. Like he even says, yeah, who thinks that a strike would be considered a form of violence? But then he makes this weird argument so that to consider that a form of violence. Like he wants apparently to talk about a strike as a form of violence. So I'm wondering, okay, if I agree, it normally sounds weird to consider that a form of violence, a strike. But then if you look at things regardless of level, you have these entities existing on totally different levels because, yeah, the state does not exist. It's an imaginary thing. It's purely a social construct. So if we apply, if you generalize the word violence to apply to social constructs, then yeah, what's all these things have in common? You can disable them. And so disabling, whether it be cutting off my hands or striking against your state's ability to function, it strikes me, okay, then you can talk about violence in all these ways, and everything he talks about can be kind of coherent. If I understand his essay correctly, I'm just wondering, does that make sense? Is that total bullshit? Is that a bad way to read it? Is it like, oh yeah, that's a good way to read it, or what?
So if why are the workers striking to start with? And what would the violent consequence of workers no longer lending or loaning their hands be? And who would experience this violent decision?
I assume that's a way to raise costs to the elites who, you know, are helped by the state. And it's either to overthrow the state, if at all possible, or at least to hinder it so that the state will concede to the workers. It's like if you punch me because I'm doing something awful, like I'm a jerk or something, and you increase the cost to me for being that kind of jerk by, you know, punching me, and that may get me to stop being a jerk. And I would think that's the same. You strike to raise costs to the state for something that it's doing to either stop it or, if, you know, even overthrow it. But that's, of course, it doesn't happen that often.
Well, there's two types of strike that I think I just saw that Simona had referenced Georges Sorel in the chat. Who, yeah, we didn't get to talking about him, but he's a super important influence on this. And he juxtaposed kind of two different types of strike. So there's the strike that that has, you know, a means end structure of like using the strike as a means to get some kind of concession from the state. But then there's the sort of mythical revolutionary proletarian general strike that it doesn't have a means end structure of trying to get something from the state. It's not using the strike as a means. It's just a total destruction of capitalist civilization, basically, in Sorel's conception. So I think, yeah, there's these two different types of strike, and I think the one would be the mythical proletarian general strike should fit more within the divine conception of violence in Benjamin's scheme, whereas, you know, striking as a means to an end to get concessions should be thought of as sort of a more routine level of yeah.
I mean, it's clear that there's one thing the text does not do, and that is answer what is violence, right? Like,
right. And I think the question TJ opened up is pretty big. I think that's something that we could definitely open up to a whole other discussion. I mean, you know, the question of violence and, you know, and its relation to the strike, you know, both the productive strike, the general strike, the consumptive strike, and the I would prefer not to strike, you know.
I guess I never thought that the intention of I think it's a really interesting question, like what defines what violence is, but I guess I never thought it was his intention to distinguish what makes something violence or not, other than that it gets determined by the state and by law. I mean, right, when you know, a cop beats up somebody but it's legal, that's like, by the state, it's not considered violence, even if it is clearly.
Right.
Yeah, yes, this weird thing that language is that violence is outside the language. Like I mentioned that already, but I just don't understand that. Like, yeah.
I think he. I can't see that language as such. No, based on what Brian was saying earlier, I think a lot about the state sort of determining violence. Perhaps one of the dichotomies we haven't touched upon is the lawmaking and law preserving violence that has been talked about, and how they relate to natural and positive law respectively. So I think those also can be explored. And my interpretation was also that perhaps divine violence is something that is outside of law and not against it, because as a strike perhaps is also a legitimate form of violence. Like a strike is like allowable, it's legible, and a strike is sort of a place in the entire scheme, while self-immolation or other forms of resistances are sort of outside of law, and sort of deep anxieties about law come through those practices, and that distinction perhaps from lawmaking and law preserving to a violence that is outside of law, to think about divine violence. That's all.
Yeah, and from there you could even extend that to the violence of including things in a law, like when something is outside law, it's outside law and that's it. But when you legalize it, then you're allowed to kind of create an entire like system of rules and regulations around it, which allow for like granular forms of violence. So you think of like drugs, for example. Drugs are illegal, and then when you're doing them, you're kind of outside law, and you just have these very, very black and white laws. That's bad. Once you legalize drugs, then you could just there's so much more information you can gather on everybody doing them, and that information then can be used to help manipulate and control and extort and guide people in various violent and seemingly not violent ways. So yeah, law. Law as violence, law as opposed to violence, and law as constituting violence, and it's quite it's quite a much more complicated thing than simply yes, no, legal, illegal, violent, not violent.
That's like from a Foucauldian perspective or something, you could say that then you end up in the realm of biopower, right? Like he's theorizing the realm of the sovereign and of law and of life and death and these kind of things, and then you have the realm of statistics and of like this sort of like power that really creeps into your head somehow, which is something that Foucault tried to map out. There are different ways in which power functions. Anyway, I shouldn't go into Foucault now.
Wow.
So how do you guys feel then about the next session? And
yeah, I mean, if someone compiles those links, I'd love to check them out. We have Derrida, Agamben, and is there Sorel or is a link for that?
Yeah,
Anxiety. Oh, that's a Deleuze-Guattarian term.
I'm just looking for it.
What was that?
For a link to Sorel on violence.
So let's compile them, and perhaps we can agree on the next time we'll meet. And I think there was another reading for next week or August, and then if you guys want to suggest, please feel free, like just send it through the mailing list.
Right. Also curiosity, just once and for all, which group is this? Does this group have a name? Okay.
I think just a general reading discussion.
General reading group?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if we want to break down the boundaries of the value group and just kind of combine it with this, that's fine too. I mean, I don't have to, yeah.
Oh, well, we're reading for the value theory, Jasper Burns, right? Revolutionary motives. Right. And
yeah.
Perhaps.
Cool. When is that?
Right. I also read the logistics piece from EndNotes, which was actually really, really good. Yeah,
I read a bunch of his shit.
I think right away after our last talk, and I really, really liked that one as well. So
yeah, that one's a great one. Yeah.
Which one is that? I read a few as well. Planning and Anarchy. No, I read Planning and Anarchy.
No, I think it's logistics.
That one's good too. Yeah, it's called Logistics, Counter Logistics, and the Communist Prospect. It's in EndNotes 3.
Yeah.
So, but do we have a date for the next one?
We don't. I think in part, I was gonna send an email and check. So, do we want to include Jasper on this one, or
I think
do another one?
To me, it makes sense to keep them separate. I mean, we don't have to, but like now we have this sort of like mystical Benjamin like thread going, which is fun to explore, and we have a value theory thread going, which is also fun. And I don't want to stop that one or something, but they do seem separate somehow, at least to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one was never intended for the value theory.
No, that was
it
my
like-
mistake.
No, but no, it's fine. I think it's good to after reading the previous one to go back into the mystical, not so practical parts of value and value form, and we could go back to just theory again, right? And I mean there are multiple. That's the thing. Like there are multiple reading groups happening, and we don't have to attend them all. Like, you know, everybody has a place and platform to suggest if they go through the facilitation process and all of that. So, and if they agree with the overall mission. But if you guys want to suggest one, really, like, that would be fantastic.
I would be kind of interested to go back and read the Theses on the Philosophy of History after reading this, because that's also a shorter text, but it's a very dense and profound in a lot of ways text, but it's written, I'm not sure how many years later, I think in the not too long before his death. Yeah, yeah, right. I think like the year before or of his death. So yeah, it'd be kind of interesting to juxtapose that with this, which is an earlier work.
Is this Joshua Clover link? Is that a picture of Berardi, or is that Joshua Clover? The Joshua Clover poem by Sadie?
Berardi, right?
Is that Berardi? Or is that what
No, that's Joshua Clover.
Oh, okay, he looks like that too. I guess everybody looks like that these days in my mind.